Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome here to Las Vegas and to the SAGES meeting. Before we get started, I'd like to get a sense of how many of you are actively involved in device or technology research? All right. Oh, now that's a good sign. And how many of you are engineers as opposed to surgeons? All right. Another. I feel vindicated. So today's lecture is going to be about technology readiness levels. How many of you have heard of technology readiness levels before or know what they are? Okay. They're involved with a number of things. And the one that you are probably most interested in is money. All right, does that help anybody? So maybe that'll wake a few up that are about ready to go to sleep. This is my disclosure slide. I'm working with one company, virtual reality simulation company in orthopedics, and it has no relevance to what I'll be saying today. This is fundamentally about understanding research from a global perspective. If you want something new and you can't buy it, this is the process that needs to go through. This is the basis for some of our most advanced researchers in the Department of Defense, NASA, NIH, and so forth. This will give you understanding of how complex it is and how difficult it is, yet to understand each other when you're talking about the research that you're doing, all right? Its entire process is called an acquisition process, meaning I want to acquire something. I want something, but it's not available. What do I have to do to make it acquirable, if you will? I can buy it. And the process is called life cycle management, from the very beginning to the very end. Technology readiness level is what we'll be talking about, is how we understand where we are in the process. And I'll mention the valley of death and the second chasm for those of you who are not familiar with it. So, this is the full life cycle development. This is what you have to do if you have an idea and you want to end up with a commercial product. This is from the Department of Defense research. And the important takeaway here is notice how much of the entire process to get a product that you can sell involves research. Approximately 10% is what you think of. I got this great idea and I built this little toy and now I want to sell it. This is the process that you have to go through. Now, you need to memorize this if you're going to, just kidding. So the purpose of technology readiness levels is actually threefold. It gives us a common language for research program development, how we can talk to each other. The words that we use mean the same thing. Very, very important. The process that I mentioned there, if you want free money from the government, it's called non-dilutional to investors, grant to those who are doing research. You'll need to go through this particular process. This is how the money flows. The money isn't actually free, it's your tax dollars. And so it starts when the budget comes from the president to Congress. And the Congress says, I got this bucket of money, I have to spend it or lose it by the end of the year. And the question is, how do we do that? Well, the congressmen and women go over their pots of money. They're on committees like Defense and Health and National Science Foundation and so forth. And they get a certain amount of money that they distribute to the different agencies. The agencies are like Department of Defense, NIH, National Science Foundation, Department of Energy. They get the money, and it's their responsibility now to spend that money before the end of the year and give it out to researchers to do the things that they want done for their particular discipline. And so the money is trickled down and portioned off to all of them, if you will. And one of the important parts of the agency is once they give you the money, then they're going to monitor it, and they monitor it by milestones. And here's where the technology readiness levels come in. So this is a very complicated process. It was recognized by Congress, and the stick here is that the money that you receive if it is in your contract to have the Bayh-Dole Act, which is just another promise, if you will, it means that any patents or intellectual property that you use to create your new device, that belongs to you. You don't have to pay it back. If you take a loan or if you go to a venture capitalist, that money is portioned off and they'll be getting some back. But if you do a government grant, you will keep all of your intellectual property. So by the end of the thing, you'll have 100% of the equity in the company, not 40% or 50%. So the role of the researchers, the scientist, it has to get from being an inventor and be in contact with other people, such as the innovator or the pioneer. The innovator is the one that you find while you're developing your project, and he says, this is a great idea, I'll work together with you, and maybe we'll have some research together, because they can bring the clinical acumen. The pioneers, those that are doing the pilot studies and the clinical trials, they're the ones with all of the arrows in their back. You can tell them anywhere, if you will, because there is resistance to change, and it's the pioneers that we need to get engaged. So if you're starting a company or working on a project, what you'll need to do is find somebody, both as an innovator who will work together with you and help you with the research that'll give you your clinical support, and then the pioneer is somebody who's willing to do a clinical trial or pilot study for you. Now, in there are two difficult periods. One is the valley of death, and the second is the second chasm, brought to our attention by Jeffrey Moore. In addition to this, you're going to have money. And this is the way, when you receive money, where you have to go for it. It doesn't do you any good to go to the government if you've got something that's already FDA approved. All right? If you want to have money, you have to go to some form of investor, such as the research agencies of the government or private investors or venture capitalists. I encourage you all to go to the Shark Tank this afternoon, I believe, and you'll be able to take some of this information and understand what happens when you understand the process and what technology readiness levels are. So what we see is at the beginning of your project, when you have a breadboard or an early prototype, or even to a part of a beta prototype, what ends up happening is the government likes to fund early research and basic science, but they're not very happy about doing the research, whether it be basic science or clinical. It's hard to find money. On the other hand, industry, you haven't proven well enough that you're going to be successful in your project, so they're very reticent to be investing early on in your research phase. And only after you've been able to demonstrate a prototype and maybe do some animal trials will you see the amount of money that you can get from them. Whether that investor is a company or it's a philanthropy, this is where you'll need to go. It won't do you any good to go to any of the government agencies because they're not interested in funding that. And usually we're looking at FDA in this area right here. The second chasm here is what happens after you've got your prototype, you're working on your clinical trials, and everybody now knows about it, and they get really excited. And that is called the Gardner's hype cycle. So what happens after you've got something, and you've seen this repeatedly, I went through it with virtual reality, surgical simulations, and robotics. Everybody gets excited, and they overhype what it's going to be able to do before it's ready to do that. And then when you start getting your product out, what ends up happening is there is this disillusion. It won't do what you think it'll do yet. I've never had a research project that I have funded that has actually got it right 100% the first time. That's virtually impossible nowadays with everything being so complex. So there's going to be some things. You can't satisfy every person in every specialty with one single device. Everybody wants to use it slightly different. So this is what's called the trough of disillusionment. And then finally people get it, you improve your product enough that it works, and then you end up going the commercial route after that. So you have a struggle throughout the way. The government funds research by specific levels. The funds that I mentioned in the previous process is allocated, is given to you, determining how ready your project was, and I showed you the process of your product. Each phase has a certain amount of money, which is given a numerical number here. And the reason that that's important is when you go for that, your technology readiness level, which I'll show you in a moment, corresponds to the kind of money the government has, the agency can give you. And that's why it's so critically important that you can't go, say, to National Science Foundation because they don't have that type of money. They've got money to spend in this area, but the government didn't give them any early research dollars or proof of concept. They just don't have it, so they won't be able to give you that money. And this, once again, is the description of what these levels are. And here is the description of the technology readiness levels. NASA has one variation on them. The Department of Defense has another. There's about 2 or 3. There's a separate one that biological research follows. The levels are essentially the same, but they mean different if you're going to build a spaceship or if you're going to build a robot or if you're going to do genetic research. But the milestones, if you will be the same. And as I mentioned, this is the early area here where you have proof of concept and you do pilot studies. Finally, you come to the FDA. Each one of these technology readiness levels. So if you go to, say, one of the booths at the exhibit hall today, and they've got something brand new to show you, this is the way you determine how far along they are, whether or not you'll ever see the light of day with that product. Because if you're down here, the chances are much less that you're going to actually make all the way, because you've got to go through all the other hurdles that we mentioned before. So that is the basic concept that I was trying to give you in a way to measure the level of performance, the readiness of the devices or the technology that you're interested in. So the technology readiness levels are a language and a process for creating a new product through the full life cycle of the acquisition process. And from concept to research to technology transfer, FDA approval, and finally to commercialization. There are a number of steps in the technology 7, 8, and 9 levels that have to do with business that I didn't address during this. And again, as a summary, they are used by Congress to appropriate the funds for you to send to agencies who are responsible for funding and oversight of the research projects to the academic and commercial researchers. And the concept is that TRLs can facilitate communication to avoid misunderstanding. Thank you very much.